This is going to be the first of a couple podcasts we will have throughout the semester. I'm going to use these along with some slides to supplement videos and other things we'll do throughout the semester. As you've noticed already, there will be discussion boards. You need to do those. Like I said in the message, they will account for 10% of your total grade by the end of the semester. So do those. Your first major assignment will be coming up next week. I'll make you read an article and then discuss it, similar to a book review, with a few specific requirements. You'll have those, though. So we're talking about Chapter 15. You've already done the section on the Aztec Empire. Today I'll cover the rest of the chapter. Now, my lectures alone are not going to be everything you need to know, but between me and the book, most of the information will be in there. So we're starting with the Inca Empire. This is slide 3 on the PowerPoint. Now, the Incas established themselves in the Andes Mountains, roughly 2,500 miles south of the Aztecs. So, almost the distance across this country, the U.S., south of Mexico. Okay, so quite a massive amount of distance. The Incas conquered many different groups, but what they did is they integrated them into the empire. They had reformed labor and military service, and some of them were resettled to minimize the chance of revolt. Could have been worse as far as how they actually treated them. These groups were kin groups, and they called Ayu, and they worked land in adjacent ecological zones. They grew crops like quinoa, a few other things like that we'll talk about a little later. As far as the Aztec or the Inca Empire goes, their major deities was the Sapa Inca and the sun god priest were part of this aristocracy, and like in the older sections, they're semi-deities, kind of in this weird zone to where their spirituality makes them more than human. Most people probably didn't think that they were actual gods, but they knew that they were favored so well that bad things would happen if you didn't follow these people's rules or didn't listen to them properly. The relatives of these people, the previous rulers, more distant relatives, and then the leaders of the group, in addition to your high-ranking military type officials. This is what you call the noble class. When an Inca ruler died, everyone who was vying for the position basically had an all-out war until someone won. Very similar to what happened with the Mongols, as well as in Europe from time to time. During his reign, the Sapa Inca lived as a living god, similar to what you know about the Chinese ruler. They had very specific rules for approaching him and how to interact with him appropriately without offending this living god. Even so, he still had to keep the support of the aristocracy. It's unbelievably easy to poison somebody or to kill them in their sleep when you are a wealthy noble with a large military behind your back. So, these people still had to watch what they were doing. Like the ancestors, the ruler was believed to continue living even after death. They mummified the bodies and other rulers and other high-ranking families, and they placed them in houses around the main square of Cusco, high in the Andes Mountains. And this site was 11,300 feet above sea level. That's pretty high. That's over 2 miles above sea level. They worship local spirits and deities that they carried with them. There were roughly 332 shrines in Cusco. 31 of them got human sacrifices. In many cases, it was a young boy or young girl, and a young girl, symbolically married. Occasionally, larger sacrifices occurred, like when a ruler died. And your book makes me laugh. It says that, but the largest number of sacrifices killed a single time was 4,000. Like, it's insignificant. Times of great crisis, you'd still have sacrifices. But still. They moved to Cusco around 1400, and according to oral accounts, roughly around 1438, Pachacuti launched his first military campaigns in the region and began the expansion. What they did is they stormed enemy forts with a large infantry, often going after access to food and water first. For several days, they'd trade insults and sang hostile songs. Attackers and quilted cotton, which in Europe they used something called quilted cotton during this time, to go under their main armor. Dates back to around 600 when Europe got a hold of it. Some areas even had it a lot earlier than that. Basically what it does is it's a buffer. Cotton with tied or sewn lines down it would have these little fluffy areas in between them, and when something hit it, that would depress, and as a result would disperse the impact. Now, of course, we talk about dealing with guns when we get to that, and even really well-made arrows and crossbows and stuff. That type of thing does nothing to stop those. But against stone weapons and stone arrows, does a pretty good job. A lot better than nothing, of course. At its height, they could field 100,000 people, which is large enough to rival the largest armies in Europe and even areas around the world elsewise. During its height, there were 10 to 12 million people living there. The most impressive thing they did is they built 25,000 miles of roads, many of which over 16,000-foot mountains. I don't know if you've ever laid stone with your bare hands and simple tools, but that is impressive. What that tells us is that this was a very organized group. It had a very distinct hierarchy, and these rulers were allowed and able to do massive public works. Most of these people were convinced into doing this as an exchange of their payment to the rulers, since they weren't all farmers. Some of them were paid, some of them weren't. But still, the number of people needed to do that is pretty extensive. So that's, that's a really big deal. From a cultural standpoint, that is just far more impressive than 100,000 in the army. Let's see. And unlike the other groups, again, they incorporated these people into into their culture. Individual messengers working in shifts could move 150 miles a day, but troops covered more like 7 to 9 miles a day. What that means is these couriers would jog or run or ride like a llama or an alpaca. They didn't really have horses at this time. Those were still in Europe, but they would move as quickly as they could, and basically like a relay race, which is kind of how that got started around the world, is someone would be carrying a message, run full speed, do some sort of handoff, the other person would take off and do their leg of the journey. So, that really helped messages move quickly. Of course, nothing like our instant stuff we have today, but still impressive for the time. The troops moved a lot slower, of course, because these are individual people moving the whole distance. With weaponry, armor, different types of wares, their eating utensils, drinking utensils. There was probably some sort of cook or chef that accompanied them. Several other groups of people that came along that slow the convoy down. For the most part, it was like many empires throughout the world. It appeared unbelievably strong and powerful, but that was mostly just on the face. Most of its subjects resented it, and each time a ruler died, the empire nearly fell apart. If an empire is running smoothly and there are no issues and everybody's good and happy, there aren't riots or upset people throwing their version of a fit or temper tantrum when a ruler dies, or people trying to flee and set up elsewhere. So, this is pretty important. Between 13 and 1500, there's a lot going on in this region of the world, Central and Southern America, and even in North America, which we'll talk about that later. So, this whole world is in a changing state right on the eve of European expansion into the area.